There it is. Good evening. My name's Mike Denham, and I'd like to welcome you to our spring semester edition of the Florida Lecture Series produced by the Lawton Chiles Center for Florida History. If you're with us for the first time, I want to give you a special welcome and also encourage you to see me or someone out front to get your name on our mailing list. And we also have an email list that we announce these programs on as well, so you can find out about future programs. Before I introduce tonight's special guest, I want to let you know about a few other programs. There are two other programs remaining this spring. Next month, on February 20th, we'll welcome Rollins College professor Leslie Kemp Poole, who will share with us her study, Tracing Florida Journeys, Explorers, Travelers, and Landscapes Then and Now. She goes back all the way to DeSoto, from DeSoto almost all the way to, certainly the 20th century, and she traces their journeys and their explorations and comments on what those places look like now. It's a great book. Then on March 20th, we'll host Rick Kilby, who will present his study, Florida's Healing Waters, Gilded Age Mineral Springs Seaside Resorts and Health Spas. He shows how Florida's natural wonders were developed and promoted as restorative destinations for America's emerging upper classes in the 1880s and 90s. Now it's my special pleasure to introduce to you my colleague and collaborator, Keith Huneycutt. A Charlotte, North Carolina native, Keith Huneycutt earned his PhD in English from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Since 1987, he has had a strong, productive career here at Florida Southern, where he has been professor of English. Along the way, he chaired the English department, and for a time, he chaired the humanities division at the college. We've had lots and lots of iterations of administration, and we used to have a humanities division, and he chaired that. At the state level, he served as president of the Florida College English Association and the Marjorie Cannon Rollins Society. Roughly 30 years ago, Keith and I began a collaboration that I think he would agree changed our lives. The details are complicated, but we discovered a cache of letters written from Florida, authored by two sisters who came to the territory in the 1830s from New Hampshire. The bulk of the nearly 900 letters were written from the Alachua County, St. Augustine, Key West, and a host of other locations in Florida that no longer exist. The letters contain, they are written to their brother, an artist who lived in Europe and also in New York. The letters contain astute observations and rare glimpses of everyday life in a time, place, and society from a woman's point of view, for which we have very limited records of what they were seeing and where they were. Many of you are familiar with the two books that we co-authored, Echoes from a Distant Frontier, the Brown Sisters' Correspondence from Antebellum, Florida, focusing on the sisters, which is, of course, outside, and then a book on Ellen and Corinna's brother, George, who followed them to Florida, and that book is entitled The Letters of George Long Brown, a Yankee Merchant in Antebellum, Florida. Tonight's program features another installment from this collection that keeps on giving. Careful reading of the letters revealed back then that the sisters wrote short stories, and there are oblique references in the letters that we would run across from time to time to their novel or our story. Eventually, a handwritten manuscript of the novel, The Storm, was discovered. It took very little time to determine that this long-lost manuscript was indeed Ellen Brown Anderson's previously unpublished novella set in Key West in 1846, the year of the awful hurricane in Key West in 1846. The story presents a woman's unique viewpoint on the economy and society of mid-19th century Key West, including the island's shipwreck salvage industry and the town's get-rich-quick mentality. The Storm is one of the first works of fiction written by a woman in Florida, the first work of Florida fiction with the first person female narrator, and the first Key West story focusing on domestic life from a woman's point of view. I want to recognize Keith's wife, Marcy, who is here somewhere, who, like my wife, Patty, has lived with the Brown Anderson family for over 30 years. And ladies and gentlemen, so please join me in welcoming Keith Huneycutt to our stage.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that introduction and pretty much for my presentation, because that's about what I was going to talk about. But I do have pictures of those things that Mike was talking about to show you. The first thing that you see is the cover of the book, and this is the last, I think it's going to be the last thing in the Brown family series. This is what the book looks like now. This is what it looks like when we first saw it. It's, as you can see from the slide, it's in the archives at the University of Florida. It was donated there in 2015. It was unsigned, it was undated, and it was a bit of a mystery. And Mike and I first found out about it. We were contacted by Jim Cusick, the curator up there, who had a suspicion that this might be something by the Brown sisters, and he had some other clues, and we went up there and talked to him, and I said, yeah, I'll take this. So that's what it looked like, and we're pretty sure, I'm almost positive, that it was done by the Brown sisters and probably Ellen, and I'll explain to you why I think that. This is Ellen. We're very fortunate with the family who has worked with us very closely on the books that we've done because we have pictures of just about all of the characters in the letters. This was done by Ellen's oldest brother, Manavalette, the professional artist in the family. He was very talented, as you can see. This is a miniature, it's blown up. But he worked with Currier, I forgot the guy's first name, but Currier of Currier and Ives. If you remember those old calendars, if any of you are that old with Currier and Ives stuff, he was an apprentice with them. He spent 10 years working and traveling in Europe, copying masterworks and doing portraits for pay. So his letters back and forth with his sisters and his brother give us a lot of information about the family. This is Corinna. She's a couple years older than Ellen. It's possible that Corinna had a hand in this story. We don't know the full details. Oh, thanks. But it seems that... Okay. Is it better now? Ooh. Okay. All right, thank you. Okay, so Corinna is possibly a co-author of this book. We're not certain, and we'll explain the details later. But the two sisters did, as Mike said, work closely together. And we know from their letters that they were collaborating on more than one novel or other works of fiction through their early years. But it's in the later years when we think that The Storm was written that Corinna probably was not actively involved, but I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. This is Manavalette. This is a self-portrait. And again, he was the oldest in the family, the oldest sibling, and contributed a great deal to what we know. These are just a few notes telling us some of what Mike has already said about the family. They came from Portsmouth, New Hampshire to Mandarin, Florida in 1835 to live with their Aunt Delia, who had first come down to Florida to set up a hat shop in St. Augustine. She married a rich planter and said, everybody come on down, and just about everybody did. A couple of years later, Corinna married a Dr. Edward Aldrich from Charleston, South Carolina, and they moved around to various places, but still kept in close contact and eventually lived with Ellen in various houses. In 1840, Ellen married Lieutenant James Anderson, who was with the U.S. Army fighting the Seminoles at the time. James and Ellen have 3 children, and James dies in 1847 in the Mexican War. And so Ellen is left by herself to raise the 3 children. Edward took in Ellen and the children, so the family now is Ellen and Corinna and the kids and Edward, but Edward moved to California in 1849 to follow the gold rush. And so that is the last that we see of him, though we do have letters back and forth. After their time in Florida, the sisters moved back north. They live in several places, but end up in New York, and that's probably where the novel was written. This is just a daguerreotype, an early photograph of Ellen's handsome husband, the soldier. And this is a map Mike and I have used several times, but it's still good for this presentation, I think, of some of the homes where they lived in Florida. So you can see they started, back up, sorry, hit the wrong button. They backed up, let's see, there they are. Okay, so Mandarin, St. Augustine, Noonensville, which is a ghost town now, Pensacola, several other places, but the most important place for tonight is Key West. They were there from 1849 to 1850. This is pretty much what Key West would have looked like in 1838, about a decade before they got there. This drawing, this sketch was done by W.A. Whitehead, who was a very prominent citizen. If you've been to Key West, you probably have been on Whitehead Street, named after him. And this was done from an observation tower. It's important for the story, for the storm, because it features this lighthouse, which is in the story, and this graveyard, which is in the story. This is one of the very first photographs of anything in Florida, done in, I think, around 1849. They're not absolutely certain. This is what Key West probably looked like when Ellen and Corinna lived there. If you look closely at these houses, they don't look too stable to me. They might be a little shoddy. That hurricane in 1846 wiped out almost everything. It killed at least 60 people, and so it had been rebuilt in those 3 years. Key West doesn't have a lot of building materials, not much lumber. What trees there were leveled in that hurricane. And so all of this stuff would have been imported from somewhere. I know they had the port of Tampa, probably from New Orleans to Tampa and so forth, to get to Florida to rebuild Key West. But somewhere they were back in this town. This church is probably the Episcopal church that they went to. So I'm very glad to have this picture. So, their writing career. Again, Mike told you a little bit of this, about the letters. The letters are important historically. They give us a lot of information about Florida at that time, and as Mike mentioned, from a woman's perspective, that you just don't get anywhere else. They're also beautifully written. They are works of art as far as I'm concerned. Just beautiful letters. So the sisters had their writing skills sharpened every day. They wrote all the time. As Mike mentioned, there are at least 900 letters in the family collection, which now has been scattered a bit, but they were all together up until 1972. Those are just the letters that have survived since the 19th century. We know they wrote a lot more because they refer to such and such letter that you just sent me, or that I just sent you last week, and we know they had other correspondents who were not in the family. So they wrote a lot. They wrote all the time. So they're writers just in that sense, important writers. But also when they were in Florida, or before they got to Florida, when the sisters lived in Philadelphia for 10 months, they got a lot of experience, a lot of exposure to a really literary culture. Manavalette had already lived in Philadelphia, and that's where he was when the three of them were working on a novel. Few of the letters from this time that have survived have plot details, character sketches, and things like that going back from Portsmouth to Philadelphia, Philadelphia to Portsmouth, and the three of them are putting together a novel. They sent it to Carey and Lee publishers, who rejected it. Corinna wrote a scathing letter to Manavalette, complaining about how unfair they were. They probably didn't read it, and I give them a piece of my mind and so forth, but didn't make any difference. They got the same treatment from lots of publishers. In Florida, the sisters continue writing stories. We know that because they refer to them in their letters, and also because we have manuscripts of some of those stories. One of them is called Sketches of Life in Florida During the Seminole War. That they never finished. 17 pages worth of it. The characters never get out of New York. So that's very frustrating, and we know why they didn't finish that. They had to take care of sick relatives. They had duties that fell on them as the women in the family, and they had to fulfill those duties. So they never finished that novel. But we do have 17 pages of it, which are a good start. And those 17 pages sound a lot like 17 pages of The Storm or 17 pages of Ellen's letters. This sounds like the same voice. All right, so they did have some success. In 1837, Corinna published a story called The Grumble Family, and thanks to Hillary and Interlibrary Loan, I have finally gotten my hands on a copy of that. She can find anything. It's a good story. It's not a great story, but it's funny. It's satiric. It's basically character sketches of shifty people, I would say. So it's pretty good. Ellen's style is different from this. Ellen likes long, involved descriptions and character development and moral messages and things like that that you just don't get from this in Corinna. So that's one reason why I'm pretty sure that Ellen wrote The Storm and Corinna didn't. In 1837, both sisters submitted essays to the Florida magazine. It was run by, or was going to be run by, a Reverend Brown, who was their friend, but not a family member. He published the Jacksonville Courier, I believe it was, Mike, yeah. But he never published the magazine. We have, or the family has in their collection, and Mike and I actually have in our temporary possession, some of these essays that I think would have gone into that journal, but they just didn't. After that, Corinna's letters never mention anything about a publishing career, about wanting to be a writer, but Ellen's do. And again, this to me is more evidence that it's Ellen who wrote The Storm. At about the time when they left, I know it's the time when they left Key West, Ellen did publish a story. And at this time, she was talking about how she wanted to develop a writing career. James had been dead a few years. In Ellen's letter, she's constantly talking about how she wants to support herself and her kids, and she thinks the way she can do it is by writing. So she's trying to pursue a career in journalism when she's in New York, and she's also writing fiction. This was published, as you see, in the Knickerbocker, which was a well-respected magazine. Writers such as Washington Irving were closely associated with it and published their work in it too. So this was a real accomplishment for her. That story is in an appendix in this book, in the back of The Storm. And for those of you who see that book at some time, you might want to look at a novel in a nutshell and look at The Storm and see if the style seems similar to you as it does to me. And there are several passages in the introduction that I point out that just sound very, very similar. So Ellen continued to try to be a writer. The Storm is, I think, her final and her greatest accomplishment. So again, this is sort of a reiteration of some of the things that I've already said and that Mike said. They were in Key West in 1849 and 50. Novel in a Nutshell, Ellen's, was published. And in 1853, this guy, George William Curtis, published a novel called The Potiphar Papers. And The Storm makes a direct reference to a character from that novel. So we know that The Storm could not have been finished before that. I doubt that Ellen and Corinna got the book immediately when it came off the press, but they would have had access to it within the next few years. But since Corinna was not in writing condition in those years, again, I'm pretty sure that Ellen would have had to finish the book after the reference to the Potiphar Papers and probably before, because it seems to me like one continuous style rather than the style of two different people. Corinna had been sick for years. We don't know exactly why, but she was addicted to morphine. We know this because her husband, who was a physician, wrote a letter to Manavalette, her older brother. The letter was written in 1854, but he was in San Francisco, where he had been since 1849, and he said, I understand that Corinna is getting worse. You cannot let her come to San Francisco. Do not put her on a boat. There will be rum on these boats. She was an alcoholic too. She will disgrace herself. Above all things, don't try to deprive her of her morphine. It would kill her. She needs 1 or 2 doses a day. And he was the one who prescribed it to her before he left Florida. So she had been addicted for at least 4 or 5 years before she died. In Ellen's letters in late 1853 and early 1854, she tells the brothers that Corinna's condition is worsening, and by the time they get to New York, she is afraid to leave the children with her. So I don't think that Corinna had much to do with this novel. I think that it had to be mostly or all Ellen. It had to have been finished before 1862 because Ellen died from breast cancer in 1862. And her last couple of years were very sad. She had fallen into really difficulty financially. Her brothers had always tried to help, but George, who was the wealthier brother, died in 1857, and his money was all tied up in investments and lawsuits, and his wife was not speaking to them and so forth. So that source of income was cut off. Manavalette had fallen into harder times. He really couldn't help much more. Ellen had taken in boarders. She had a lot of trouble with them. And so it was really a rough time for her. Her eyesight was fading, and then she developed breast cancer. And there's a very sad letter written, I forgot which month in 1862, but Ellen writes a letter to Manavalette and says, Manavalette, can you come take care of my girls when I die? And it's really sad to hear that. So she was not writing much at the time. She was concerned with other issues. When she died, her papers, including the letters and the manuscripts, went to Villette, her oldest daughter. We know this for a fact because Manna Villette describes the bag of manuscripts and letters and stuff that she takes out and carefully goes through them, and she writes to Manna Villette and says, these do tell a wonderful story. So we know that Villette had these. She moved, both sisters, Villette and Georgia, moved in with Manna Villette after Ellen died, but they ended up in Washington, D.C. with Edward Anderson, their brother, and they stayed in Washington, D.C. until they died. Edward inherited their letters and Corinna's and all the manuscripts and kept them in his house in Washington, D.C. until he died. And then his heirs and several generations of other Anderson Brown family members stayed in that house and kept the letters and the manuscripts. It was either in the basement or the attic. We get two different versions of that, but they were all in one chest together. So they kept them there for 100 years. Then, in 1972, John Traynor, who was the husband of Ellen's great niece, took those family papers when the family was selling the house because George Anderson had just died and they were splitting up the estate, and he got the letters and the whole box of manuscripts, packed up 500 of them and brought them to Florida. All of them that were related to Florida in one way or another, he put in an attaché case and carried them to the University of Florida. I mean, a perfect choice. That's where you would want to take this kind of thing. When he got there, he talked to the library staff, and they said, "Yeah, this is kind of interesting stuff." And they locked it all in a safe to be examined and appraised. This went on for 3 years, and finally, they decided at the library that they did not want to pay the price that he wanted them to pay for those letters and the manuscript. So another gentleman, Norm Lacoe, one of Mike's special friends, an Alachua County attorney and an amateur historian who is very much interested in Alachua County affairs and history, helped him find purchasers for the letters. And I think as a sort of a favor or as a payment to show Norm his appreciation, John Traynor gave him the storm, free of charge. Seems like a fair trade for all the work that Norm went through, including photocopying in very fine quality all 500 letters. And we have those photocopies too, so we appreciate those. Norm went to various places trying to sell the storm. He thought he might publish it himself. He contacted a library in Key West, various other people around the state. He couldn't get a publisher. He couldn't sell it to anybody for what he thought it was worth until finally he found a bookseller in Micanopy, O. Brisky. And some of you might have seen this bookstore from years ago. If you ever happened to go through Micanopy, it was a very famous place to go. And this guy had all sorts of Florida stuff. It was just a great center of Florida knowledge. But he died in 2014. And his store manager, Gary Nips, took over the store and sort of settled things and closed it in 2015, sold off the stock, but he donated the storm to the University of Florida, so it ended up right back where it was when it first came down and back in the safe at the archives. That's where Mike and I come in, because the archivist at the University of Florida called or sent an email to Mike first and then to me, and then we got together and figured, yeah, this is something that we want to look at. And again, let me just reiterate why I think it's Ellen who wrote this and not Corinna. We know it was one of the Browns because it was with their family letters, and it had to be someone with firsthand knowledge of Key West. That would have been Edward, Corinna, or Ellen. Not Edward. We have a few of his letters. They're like 50 words long. He never was interested in writing, never wrote about anything creative, strictly business, fine fellow, but not a writer. And again, I've been through the Ellen and Corinna evidence of why I think it was Ellen. It couldn't have been Corinna because of her illness. Oh, and the one thing that I haven't mentioned before is family tradition. Raymond Gill told me a couple of summers ago, Raymond is the husband of one of the great nieces, that Aunt so-and-so always said that Ellen wrote a novel. Never said Corinna wrote a novel, but always Ellen wrote a novel. In every other matter that the family has passed on to me and Mike, they have been right. So I figured they must be right about this too. And Aunt, whoever it was, thank you for that extra little boost in my theory. Okay, there are a couple of issues, possibilities of why it might not have been Ellen, her bad eyesight, for one, and the handwriting doesn't match hers or Corinna's, but the solutions are pretty simple. Ellen's daughter, Georgia, was her amanuensis. We know this because in one of the letters to Manifolet from Ellen, it's not in her handwriting, it's in Georgia's. And she tells Manifolet, Georgia is my amanuensis now. So that's how we know. Pretty good evidence. And the handwriting closely resembles Georgia, that's Georgia, from other sources. This is one of her letters, and this is the storm. On the storm page, it looks a little clearer, but that is natural, I think, because this was going to be sent to a publisher. Also over here, you have some ink spills. So Georgia is using a cheaper pen, and she's writing faster when she's doing her personal correspondence, and she's taking her time when she's doing something that's going to go to a publisher. Another sort of mystery about the manuscript is the 3 illustrations that were stuck with it. So when we got to the University of Florida, went to the archives, we noticed that they're stuck in there in part of it. The first one, this is the main character, the narrator and protagonist, Jenny Mansfield, in her mosquito tent. And that's a very fine mosquito tent, I think you'll agree. This is a close-up, see the fine work. And then down here, this looks like a signature, but it's kind of hard to make out, though that looks like a B. And all of the experts that I've consulted say that looks like a B. B for Brown, Manifolet Brown, her artist brother. Manifolet would have done this for her free of charge. Anybody else would have charged, and Ellen didn't have any extra money. So it's probably Manifolet. The second illustration, this is the cover illustration. This one has no signature. It's very similar in style to the first one, but it could have been another hand, and I think that other hand would have been Villette, Ellen's oldest daughter, who was herself an artist, an illustrator. She worked in Washington, D.C. in the patent office doing illustrations for inventions. And she also took lessons from Manifolet. Both of the girls did, so her style would be similar to his. So it could have been Villette. The third illustration, this is Jenny floating in the water. And that is Villette. Again, we have photographs, paintings of almost all the family members. Okay, so finally, the storm itself. This is what happens. It is set in 1846, the year of the big hurricane. This is also known as the Havana hurricane. It did a lot of damage there. I don't know how many people it killed there, but there were at least 60 in Key West. A lot of accounts of this. It has a first-person narrator, Jenny Mansfield, an older person who is reflecting on her youth. When she was 16, She married a fellow named Peter Greenough. He was 29. She was 16. He took her to Key West from New York to get rich. Basically, he says that. She's kind of frustrated with her life. She complains about her subordinate marital role, her very limited education, and the social restrictions that keep her from even leaving the house without her husband, keep her from going out and exploring the island without a protector, as she refers to her husband. She is not a happy person. These same ideas appear in numerous places in Ellen's letters. The narrator just happens to use a lot of weather metaphors in this story, especially storm metaphors. So we have an emotional storm, and you'll see where that leads if you read the book. But there's also an actual hurricane in this story. I have examined all of the antebellum fiction written in Florida. This is the first hurricane story by a woman. After that, lots of hurricane stories. You can think about Zora Neale Hurston and Their Eyes Were Watching God. You can think about The Big Storm that's in The Yearling by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. But this is the first hurricane that any woman writer brings into Florida literature. Where does the storm fit in American literary history? It is part of the genre of travel literature. There was really a big increase in literacy and printing throughout America in the 1840s and 1850s. And a lot of those people who were trying to fill the need for literature wrote about places where they went to as they were fulfilling America's manifest destiny. Many went west, some went north, and this one goes south as far as you can go. So it fits in that. Sentimental lit, that was a term first coined by male critics to cast a little bit of scorn on women writers who were writing things they said are just sentimental, this is not serious literature. But the outlook on that has changed a good bit. A lot of serious scholars and readers like this literature now and respect it because it deals with things that a lot of things written by male writers, such as, I don't know, Washington Irving again, and others, did not cover. Human connections, feelings, morals, values, sort of a celebration of these things that the men looked down on and the women took over and explored. It's a Bildungsroman. It's a coming-of-age story. Jenny grows up in the course of this 90-page story, and it's a novel of awakening. This is a big genre at the time, and later it actually becomes even bigger if you think about things like Madame Bovary or Jane Eyre, a little bit after this, or about the same time actually, where a female protagonist sort of stands up to the patriarchy. There was somebody in Florida doing this in the 1850s. Nobody else in Florida seemed to know that there were such issues. Okay, and again, Florida First, Hurricane. It's one of the earliest works of fiction set in Florida, written by a woman who actually lived there. There's a lot of antebellum Florida literature. There are 10 novels written in Florida before the Civil War. There are a lot of stories, but very few of those were written by people who even visited Florida, much less lived there. There's a collection. There's this very small handful of stories that actually were written by people who were in Florida, and The Storm is one of those. It's the first-person female narrator and protagonist anywhere in Florida. It's the first story that depicts domestic life from a woman's point of view. You want to know what people were cooking, what people were eating, what kind of gardens they had, where they went to socialize and dance. You don't find out unless you read The Storm. So it's pretty significant for that, I believe. And I know it's the first Florida story that focuses on women's education and their subordinate marital roles. There were other writers like Caroline Lee Hintz, who published works, extensive novels actually, before this was written. But those, I think, could be set anywhere in the South, and they're basically plantation apology literature. This is uniquely Florida. Key West, just narrowing it down, and Key West has a huge literary tradition of its own, aside from the rest of Florida. This is the first full depiction of Key West in fiction. There are other references to Key West. There was a story written in 1846 by a woman. It's called The Pirate of Key West. I think her last name was Gould. And that story spends one page in the port of Key West, and that's it. There's nothing in Key West, and that writer had never been to Florida either. So this is a first. It's the first with a woman and a female narrator. And it's the only 19th century depiction of shipwreck salvaging, which is a big thing, or was, in Key West, and Key West from a domestic perspective. All of the other literature, mostly newspaper accounts of the wrecking industry, talk about the courage and the skill of the wreckers as they save people's lives and salvage goods off of the reef when these ships wreck, but they never say what happens to it when it makes it to the port of Key West. This story tells you how people dealt with all of this huge amount of one thing, like a cargo full of textiles. It's not like Walmart crashing on the shore. You get all of one thing. So how they auctioned it off, how they divided it up, what they did with it, and how it impacted their lives. You don't get that anywhere else. This is what wreckers looked like. They're the smaller boats, the ones that are actually floating. This is one that's wrecked on the reef. They had movable keels so they could draw them up and just skid right over the reef. And they also believe they waxed their keels. They were very fast and could go in light wind, so they could get out there and rescue people before they drowned, usually, and then get all the stuff. Whoever got there first could claim the cargo. That was the rule. Oh, this is Ellen. Late in life, this is probably what she looked like in her widow's weeds as she was embarking on her writing career. I have a few excerpts from the storm. Mike, do I have a couple of minutes? 5 minutes. Okay, just stand up and scream. I'll skip this first one, and I'll go straight to the second one. You read along if you want to. This is a description of the view from Jenny's house when she first gets to Key West. She says, this is Jenny the narrator, the pillars of the piazza made a framework through which I looked. There was the great ocean stretching far away from eastern to western horizon, interrupted only by a low white bank or quay, or quay, which I take to be the original Spanish word for these peculiar islands. All along this expanse of water floated vessels of all nations, builds, and sizes. 2 or 3 were always in sight, one perhaps in such a position that her sails were white with the reflected light of the moon, while of another the sails were all in shadow. Imagine these seen through the openings in the dark outline of the foliage, the moonlit seas, the glancing sails in the distance, the white pillars to frame them in, and you have the panorama to which I had a perpetual ticket of admission. And that view is this view. This is the first illustration exactly describes what, or depicts what she wrote there. So it was not just a chance picture. This one is a little bit of social satire or commentary. The narrator says, in Key West, there were only rich folks, and I can spend as much money as you, was the open boast. Poor Mrs. Potiphar would have gone mad among them. There was sudden wealth in unaccustomed hands without any leading example to imitate. When an ignorant, low-bred man becomes wealthy, he boasts and blusters and imitates his neighbors in building fine houses, gambling or drinking, as his particular idiosyncrasy may lead him. All ignorant low-bred woman an ignorant low-bred woman has no such range of choice. Her one idea of wealth is dress. When men envy one another, they pick a quarrel and fight it out. When women envy one another, they backbite and snarl and serve each other with little petty annoyances so long as they are within hail of each other's distance. Moreover, they do not like to lose sight of each other, for this feeling is strong as love and is often mistaken for it. I've seen two people who could not bear to separate, so great was their desire to quarrel. Who has not? So an early depiction of frenemies. And here's a serious passage, dialogue about marriage. Jenny is talking to Mr. Mansfield, the lighthouse keeper. She explains her belief that it was a great misfortune for anyone to marry. So slim was the chance of marrying to content oneself. Mr. Mansfield thinks that her being a 16-year-old bride is fine because women mature much younger than men. She answers, "It seems to me we women never have a chance to mature. It's the fashion to take us from school at 16 and 17 and set us about getting married, whereas boys of the same age are put at school, trade, or business, and the hardest kind of study." "How would you like that?" said Mr. Mansfield. "Much," I declared. And then finally, a little melodrama. After the storm hits the island, this is a description. Jenny, the narrator, is going out and searching for someone. Beyond the lighthouse, there had been a graveyard. Dismal indeed was the sight we encountered. The headstones were all blown out of their places, some far up among the underbrush. But most horrible of all, the very dead had been forced from their graves, and in some instances, the corpses were entangled with the grave clothes in the trees and shrubbery around. There's a newspaper account of this very scene that she must have read, because that really happened. The grave just opened up in that storm. Okay, that's the citation for the images. All of the family things came from the family, and the others came from the Florida State Archives. These are some family members, not Mike and me, but we might as well be, but Raymond and Jane. Jane and Betsy are the great-great-great nieces of Ellen. Betsy has passed on since this photograph, but her daughter, Elizabeth Traynor, has worked with us and helped us a great deal too. She's an illustrator, so the family talent still lives on. Okay, so that, if you want to know more, this is one of the books that Mike was talking about. Okay? Thanks, Mike.
Tell you what, I'm gonna take this down and ask questions. I'm sure people have some questions. Okay.
With the microphone. Keith, were there any people in this book not white?
Is anyone not white? Yes. Diana, the servant, is not white. She is a cook and a house servant. And although in the story, can you hear me? Can you hear? Is that close enough for you to hear? In the story, she is called a servant, but in the 1850s in Key West, Florida, she would have been a slave. So yeah, there is one person who is not white in the story. Diana.
Race relations do not figure at all.
There is no discussion of race relations. I kept hoping that Ellen would be an abolitionist. Her brother, Man of Lit, is, and they actually get in arguments about this. He says, just before the Civil War breaks out, he tells her that she should not allow her son Edward to join the Confederacy, and she says, but his father is from Virginia. He has to follow his father's path, and so that was it. Now,
All of those dynamics are really well, I think, documented, and the tensions are documented in that book. Yeah.
yeah,
Manvillette moves to Utica, New York, and lives there his entire career after he gets back to Europe. And so she's very much dependent upon him when her husband dies. And so she lives in New York City, and he lives in Utica, and you can just imagine them going back and forth on the train all the time. But they have a ongoing debate and arguments through the mail about all of this stuff. And of course, their youngest brother, which is depicted in the other book, was very much involved in buying and selling African people. He was a merchant in Newnansville, Florida, in Alachua County, which meant that he was very much in the very beginning of the slave world as it was expanding south. So those issues are covered extensively in that book. Oh, here we are.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation. This is really interesting.
well, thank you.
In looking at the timeline that you have presented of the sisters' lives and their movement, it seems unusual to me that they would have traveled so extensively throughout the United States and lived in so many different places, most of them for a fairly short time. I don't know if they came from wealth or whatever, but could you comment on that a little bit?
Well, the sisters were used to sea travel from their early years. They lived in Portsmouth, a port city. Their father was the captain of a privateering vessel, the Fox. So they were around travel their whole lives, really. They were comfortable with that. And when they went to Florida, it just was no big deal to them to take a ship down and stop in Charleston and Savannah and then finally come down to Florida. They describe everything they do, but to them it's nothing new. And when they get to Florida, and they move constantly, as you see, as you saw from the map, it was largely because their husbands did. Edward, Corinna's husband, could never be satisfied. He would set up a business here, a pharmacy here. He would set up, he would follow the Army and worked with the U.S. Army as a surgeon. He would move from place to place. That's how they ended up in Key West. There was an opening at the Marine Hospital in Key West, and he thought he would have that job. He went there. It was actually a political appointment, and he didn't get it, and that's why he moved to California. So he was one reason. The other reason was James. Ellen's husband was a soldier, and she went with him wherever he went, and basically the Army was chasing Seminoles all over Florida and had a hard time catching them, by the way.
And after the Seminole War, she followed him to the Michigan Territory. Michigan Territory with her 3 children.
And they lived in Georgia also.
Yeah, and then they live in what is today.
Huneycutt is one place. Jacksonville, Sewanee Springs, Piccolata, I believe it was.
Piccolata.
Marietta, Georgia. They went all over the place. And one of the benefits of those letters is that they describe their modes of travel.
They also were in Buffalo, New York at the military base, military fortification in Buffalo, New York, guarding the Canadian border from invasion of the Canadians, right, in the 1840s. So, and then of course James has to join the army in Mexico. So then Ellen comes back to Florida. They are traveling all the time, and a lot of their letters reflect what they see as they travel around and their comments on people, and it's quite interesting. Yeah, you can get a real sense of what it was like to travel back then.
Oh, and one thing that I didn't mention, but you saw the illustration of Jenny floating on the water. That's because there is extensive description of a woman, Jenny, traveling by steamboat and sleeping overnight on the steamboat below decks with a bunch of men. I don't think that's anywhere else in literature. So we just get all sorts of interesting travel details from the fiction and from the letters from these sisters.
Thank you for the presentation tonight. As editor, is there any material that you left out that was in the storm? And if so, is there anything you regret not including post-publication?
Did I leave out any of the story, you mean? No, I didn't leave out any of the story. The whole story is in the book, every bit of it. And there are only 90 pages, so there was no need to cut. And the editing process was fairly easy for this compared to editing the letters because the manuscript was in good shape. I did have to make a few editorial choices about punctuation especially. That's maddening. A few spelling choices, but generally I left it pretty much like I saw it without making changes.
Now leaving things out would have been the problem in that book and also the George Brown book, because we had to select which letters, told the story of what we were trying to tell. And sometimes that was a hard choice, to leave this letter in or maybe just summarize it or something like that in a introduction or something like that. So that was where that really came into play.
But we picked all the good ones, didn't we?
I think so. Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm curious, given the fact that Ellen traveled so much, and Jenny in the novel is quite a recent transplant to Key West, and she doesn't spend that much time there, I wonder if some of the way that Ellen describes the isolation, the social isolation that Jenny goes through, having been a product of her own moving from place to place and never really having time to put down roots. I wonder, do you know how much information we have from other sources about female communities in Key West and what that might have been from the perspective perhaps of someone who had been there longer and had time to maybe engage in more homosocial kinds of relationships with other women, and what that perspective might be, how it might be different for women who were living there longer term?
So
I can answer that.
So the question is, Melissa, do we know whether the sisters were involved in the community outside of the household there? And we know that they had some friends.
Sure, they comment on people down there, the women that they met all the time. Ashen Hart's wife, for example, who was a lawyer down there. There's some people some women that they refer to continually. And then also in St. Augustine, when they live in St. Augustine, they interact with a lot of women there. So they're connected to a lot of the women, and they name them and they talk about their interaction. So
And
so
in
you're
Key West,
yeah,
there was a community of women.
right, there are, yeah. Well, this is, according to the University of Florida Press, that is The Storm, an academic book, a scholarly academic book, which means that it cost extremely a lot of money, right? Over $100 for a book, almost about 100 pages, because it's an academic book. But the University of Florida Press has granted us tonight a special price for that book, because you are not college librarians and university librarians who have huge budgets and can pay a lot of money for books. So the University Press of Florida has given us a special price of $40 for this book. So it's a great book. Get it. In fact, get all three of them, and you can get a sense of just the whole story of this amazing family. Anyway, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you in February.